Everyone, Adam here, So What's Your Podcast? We're back with another Amazon series review for you. Carnival Row Season 2 is coming out tomorrow as of this video, February 17th. I was into it, but not dying for it. Unfamiliar with Carnival Row. It's kind of an alt-universe fantasy show where humans live amongst other fantasy creatures, fairies being a big one, and I'm blanking on the name of humanoid people, humanoids with horns, but they also have like the bottom half of a goat. I know it was a big character in the Narnia franchise. I'm racking my brain for it, but I cannot think of what the species is called. But there's other species in the world like that as well, and it's a normal thing. It's not like this just came out of nowhere. So it's kind of turn of the century type setting with these fantasy creatures involved. Season 1 was a pretty good, tight story, which made it a little easier to get into. This is not exactly my kind of fantasy. It's a little too gritty and dirty, and I think a lot of that is the time period that it's mimicking. Obviously, it's not a real time period, because Game of Thrones was a fantasy series that wasn't filled with whimsy and everything like that, but it was a very well-written show and someplace in the real world, but it had a nice aesthetic to it where everything in Carnival Row just kind of looks dirty. And that's not to say the CG and the costuming and stuff, it's all good. It's intentional. It's all right on point. So if you're into this time period and you're into fantasy, this is probably a good combination for you, where I have a hard time looking past it to the people. The costuming, while it is very well done and looks fantasy period specific, I guess you could say, it just doesn't quite do it for me personally. And I understand that's a total personal touch. It's not a critique on the quality in any way. While we're talking about the look and the aesthetic of the show, it is very dark. So, maybe turn the brightness up on your TV a little bit or watch it in a dimly lit room or something like that. And being that it's a fantasy series, there is a lot of things created, whether through CG or practical effects, and those are all spot on. I mean, especially for being a series just in its second season, the fairy folk flying around look great. And these are human-sized fairies. If you didn't watch the first season, Cara Delevingne plays the main character, who is a fairy. She's paired up with Orlando Bloom, who is a human. But when Cara brings out her wings and they fly, they're kind of like dragonfly wings. They look great. It's believable. The flight doesn't look silly. It's very cool. Same goes for the effects on the goat people. David Gyasi plays Agrius. I mean, I just watched the show. I should know how to pronounce the character's name. He's a pretty main point. He plays one of the, I want to say it's a forest nymph is the character, but that might be from Greek mythology. But he plays one of the goat people, for lack of a better word. And it's pretty clear, at least it looks it, where the head, it's kind of this piece here with the horns that come down, and it all looks great. It looks like a practical effect of the blending here. There's no seams or anything. It looks really, really good. And then I'm guessing the bottom of his legs, which you don't see all the time, where it becomes goat, is, I would guess that's CG because the way the legs bend out and everything, but it's all very good, very convincing. That's all there. The only thing that really rubbed up against me was the time period, which is no real fault of the show, and certainly not a fault of the set dressers, the costume designers. Going into season 2 of Carnival Row, one thing I was very grateful for is they did about a 6 or 7 minute previously on. Because so much goes on in a streaming show, and because the nature of most of us watching TV now is to binge the entire thing, or at least the entire thing in like the span of a week or two. We're not sitting there week to week for 22 weeks like it used to be, or even 12, or even the 8 that the streaming series seasons are. That, coupled with the fact that season 1 came out in 2019, definitely watch that catch up. This is a thing where if you didn't watch Carnival Row season 1, the catch up will give you everything you need to watch season 2. But if you're curious enough, I would say to watch season 1 first. One thing I really liked when it came out, because it was a lot of new stuff to swallow, it's not built on a familiar IP, at least not familiar to me. It was a murder mystery, when you really boil it down to its base thing. Of course, there's different things going on with the character relationships, with the world, with the bigotry in the world. It has all those things in it as well, both story-wise and kind of a reflection on our own world, which is interesting to do in a fantasy genre because, science fiction does that a lot. Fantasy, maybe not as much, but it does it really good in here. So it is hitting that thing that everyone really was gravitating towards in a Game of Thrones, where it's human stories in a fantasy setting, even if the characters are not exactly human, but it's relatable. Love that aspect of it. Going into season 2, And mind you, this is spoiler free. I'm only 2.5 episodes into the season. I do plan on finishing it. We'll get more into that after. But I wanted to do the video before I had things to spoil. I'm not sure what the overall thrust is for this season yet. I know what's going on with individual characters. I'm picking up on individual threads and I'm seeing possibilities of where they could go, but it doesn't have that super tight cohesion that really helped me hang on into season 1. I mentioned that I would be finishing this, though I haven't yet, because this is the final season. I've come this far. I've watched 11 out of 18 possible episodes. Why not see it through? I don't dislike it. Some things don't really click with me. It's not a show I'm rabid for the next episode for, but it's one I'm enjoying enough that I am curious to see the characters through the end. Season 2 is likely the last season because, one, it's been 4 years between seasons. 2, it has to be incredibly expensive to maintain the sets, the costuming, do the CG as it's needed, and do it all properly. And a show like this, if you're not going to do it properly, it is time to just end it and walk away. Another issue is COVID hit in the middle of, or at the beginning of filming the second season. Season 1 debuted in 2019. They started filming season 2 in 2019. And then the pandemic shutdowns. Actors weren't sure when they were going back to work. Everyone kind of split. Orlando Bloom's wife had a baby. He couldn't go back to work right away. So it seems to be, because I looked into it a little bit, it seems to be that all of these things just kind of left a bad taste in the studio's mouth. The writers wanted to be able to finish their story on their terms. And there was probably some studio pressure because it's 4 years of holding on to all these things with no end in sight. So they had to just kind of move things along to get to it. As far as a recommendation goes, if you're into hard fantasy, I guess would be the term. If you want a more gritty fantasy story, this isn't like The Hobbit. There's not a lot of merriment going on. It's not as profound as like the first 5 seasons of Game of Thrones, for example. I think it's got a little bit more excitement than at least the first handful of episodes of Rings of Power. There's a lot there to like if you're into hard fantasy. If you're not into hardcore fantasy, it will be a hard sell. This is fantasy. This does it up and does it up big and takes it very seriously. I would recommend starting with season 1 before jumping into season 2. And if for whatever reason it's an either or, I would say go with season 1 so that you get that cohesive, tight story. And there's a lot of great world building. Carnival Row season 2. Thank you to the people at Amazon for sending the screeners along. The series debuts February 17th on Amazon Prime. I believe it's going to be a full season drop. So if you're anticipating this, you should be able to binge them all right away. Don't hold me to that. It might be week to week, but I'm pretty positive it's an all at once. Please make sure to like and subscribe. Do all the things. Got a lot more coverage coming your way. You're not going to want to miss out. Make sure you listen to So Wizard Podcast every single week wherever you get your podcasts. So Wizard Podcast can also be found on Patreon, where for as little as $1 a month, you get multiple monthly bonus shows. SoWizardPodcast.com is your resource for reviews, recommendations, videos, merchandise, and more. We love hearing feedback, so drop us a note in the comments, leave us something on social media. All accounts will be found after the show and in the show notes. And on a more personal note, a good friend and I have an ongoing comedy comic series. It's called Social Studies. It's a slice of life or coming of age story. We write it like a sitcom. It's done in the vein of the 90s cartoons that we grew up on, love, and inspired us. You can find all available issues on socialstudiescomic.com. We got a bunch on Comixology and a bunch on Global Comics, with more coming. A new issue is going to drop in just another week or two. We're very excited. Check it all out. Thanks.